Welcome back to the competition studio at the 2025 International Paderewski Piano Competition in Bydgoszcz. I'm your host, Jared Dunn, and we're live in the studio this afternoon, November 11th. It is day 2 of the first stage. And you were just hearing Hao Wei-lin from Chinese Taipei, finishing Beethoven's Sonata in E major, Opus 109. I wanted to feature that performance because I particularly appreciated its voicing and clarity. And joining us in the studio today from Boston is Dr. Molly Gebrian. I think she's on screen now. Hello, Molly.
Hello, good morning. Nice to see you.
Welcome. Thank you so much for getting up early to be here with us.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Now, for some people, having someone who's not a practicing concert pianist in the studio might be a little bit strange at a piano competition, but I'd like to introduce Molly as one of the most important members of our professional music community. Molly is a doctor of neuroscience and has done much research on performance science and pressure and studies on the brain. And Molly, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your background and what brought you to this research that you've done that's culminated in your recent book.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a professional violist. My doctorate is actually in viola and not in neuroscience, but I do have a background in cognitive neuroscience. I studied neuroscience and viola as an undergraduate at Oberlin, and the neuroscience was just for fun. When I was at Oberlin, I had no plans to go on with it. But then after Oberlin, I went to New England Conservatory for my master's, and I really missed the neuroscience. And so I was very lucky that at New England Conservatory, when I was a student, I was allowed to do a number of independent studies looking into aspects of music in the brain that I had been interested in at Oberlin, just to inform my own practicing and performing and that kind of thing. And then after I finished at New England Conservatory, I went to Rice University for my doctorate in viola, but I was back at a research institution. So I was able to take graduate level neuroscience classes with the neuroscience PhD students pretty much the whole time I was there, even though I wasn't officially enrolled in the neuroscience program there. I worked in a lab for a long time. I did a whole bunch of stuff at Rice, continuing to combine the science on learning and memory with practicing and performing. So now, like you said, I teach at New England Conservatory. I teach classes on the science of practicing, applying what scientists have learned about learning and memory and how we as performers can apply that in the practice room so that it pays off when we get on stage and we can play that the way we want. And I work with musicians all over the world, applying this stuff from beginners through professionals, the whole gamut, lots of instruments. And like you said, I wrote a book on the science of practicing that came out about 1.5 years ago now.
And it's done very well, as far as I know. I've read it, and I can highly recommend that book. Learn Faster, Perform Better.
Yes,
that's with Oxford University Press. Am I right?
Yes, that's right. Oxford University Press. Yeah.
I'd love to pick your brain a little bit about teaching musicians who are at somewhere like the New England Conservatory how to practice, which is something most people would assume they know when they get into school. How has that been?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like I said, I work with all level of musicians, and what I find is that even musicians at the highest level often have never been actually taught how to practice. They have been told by teachers, maybe they have been taught some things about how to practice, but it's very common, unfortunately, for people to just be told by their teachers, you need to work on this more, you need to practice this more, bring it back next week and, practice it more. And very little guidance is often given on how exactly to do that. And there's a lot of research on how the brain works that is actually quite counterintuitive. For instance, the fact that we make the most progress during breaks, that our brains do a lot of processing and consolidation of what we've learned during a break, that's really counterintuitive to think that the breaks are just as important as the actual practicing. It's also very counterintuitive that we learn faster and we retain things better if we are constantly switching between things while we're practicing. This is something known as interleaved practicing, as opposed to what's known as blocked practicing, which is how most of us practice and we're taught to practice, which is focus on one thing for a big, long period of time, get that down, and then move on to something else. But the research is very clear that if you're constantly switching between things and working on something for a little bit, and then leaving it, and then coming back later and doing a little bit more work, leaving it, coming back later, that's a much more effective way to practice, even though on the face of it, it seems very chaotic and isn't going to work very well. But the science is really clear. I've been practicing that way for gosh, many, many years now. And after having done block practice for all of my education, because I didn't know, I've seen the difference whenever I share this information with students. It doesn't matter the level. They're like, what is this? This feels like magic. How am I getting better so much faster? And I feel like I'm spending less time in the practice room. It's like, well, now you're practicing in a way that's aligned with what the brain actually needs.
That's fascinating. So I want to ask you on the heels of that right away, what are some of the things that the brain would go through at an event like the Paderewski competition? Something with several stages, it's highly competitive, the level is very, very high, and they all come in very much aware of what the payoffs are if they win.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's impossible to say what any one person's brain is doing, right? But there's a number of things watching the performers. There's a number of things that I feel pretty confident that their brains aren't doing, which is allowing them to play so successfully. Because we know, for instance, especially at very high levels of performance, be it in music or athletics or whatever, that if you are thinking too much about the specific details of this finger has to do this, or I have to play this note now, you're not going to play well. That the brain can't handle that much information thinking about it consciously, like this note, this note, this note, this note. We do much better when we think big picture. And in that clip you just played, and in many of the clips from the competition, you can see from the pianist's faces that they are thinking about what they're trying to express, right? They're not thinking, first I play A, now I play B, right? They're not thinking in that really detailed way. And the research is very clear that when you think in that big picture way, and for us as musicians, you're thinking about what you're trying to express, how you're shaping the phrase, all these things, that it frees up what we colloquially know as muscle memory, but it frees up muscle memory to self-coordinate. And then you play a lot better than if you're trying to consciously control everything. And so pianists who were in this competition, who were playing at a really high level, have practiced to make sure that they are thinking in this big picture way and trusting that their muscle memory, which is not stored in our muscles, it's in our brains, that their muscle memory will take care of the particulars of how to play.
Can I pause
so that's
you there?
one thing. Yeah, for sure.
What is muscle memory?
What
How does
is
it really
muscle memory?
work?
Right. So the actual name for it is procedural memory. And in our brains, we have a lot of different types of memory that all work together so seamlessly that they feel like one unitary thing. But like, I think we've all experienced short-term memory versus long-term memory, right? Somebody tells you their phone number, you don't have a good way to write it down, you have to hold on to it. That's short-term memory versus remembering something that happened like a long time ago. That's long-term memory. And I think we all know how those feel different, right? If you have to remember a phone number, you have like this pressure to keep saying it in your mind versus something you learned a long time ago. So there's all these different types of memory. Procedural memory is our ability to do things, and it could be as complicated as playing the piano, or it could be as simple as walking, right? If you have very young children in your lives who are learning how to walk, you know that that's a very effortful thing for them. They have to figure out how to coordinate their legs and their balance, and they fall down. And it's not easy to do when you're a little baby and you're learning to walk. But as adults, we walk around just fine. That's using muscle memory in the same way that playing the piano is. It's the specific pattern of firing in our brains where the memory is actually stored. All our memories obviously are stored in our brains, right? But we colloquially call it muscle memory because it feels like our body just remembers how to do it, but it's not the body remembering. It's the brain remembering and communicating with the body. But it's very strong. Procedural memory is extremely strong. Very durable. This is why they say you never forget how to ride a bike, right? That if you learn how to ride a bike as a kid and then you don't ride for many years, you get back on a bike and maybe at first you're like, oh, this is a little weird, but pretty instantly your body remembers how to do it. It's not your body, it's your brain, but it feels like your body remembers.
So there's something I'd like to follow up on with that. The clip we just heard, the pianist is finishing a high velocity passage that is really exciting and exuberant, which subsides almost instantly into a really slow chorale that's very, very quiet. How does one manage to make that kind of a transition? We might talk about it with our students by giving them a lot of interesting imagery or beautiful poetry, especially in a composer like Beethoven. But what's really going on in the procedural memory for someone who's flipping the switch that quickly?
Right, exactly. Yeah. I mean, the hardest thing I would say from a performer standpoint is managing the adrenaline, right? That comes from playing something so exciting and then going to something very, very slow. In terms of the muscle memory, obviously the brain has those patterns of activity that correspond to the fast music and correspond to the slow music. The role of the pianist in that moment is to make sure that they are switching their focus from whatever they were thinking about in the fast music, which is likely that big picture stuff that we were talking about again, and then switching their focus to, okay, what do I want to be thinking about in this beautiful chorale passage to keep myself calm, not get in the way of my muscle memory, not start to overthink it and sort of over control everything so that I can play this. And that what you're actually thinking, how you're controlling yourself is a really important thing to be doing in the practice room to decide, okay, how am I going to make this transition in my thinking? Because again, they are not thinking about the specifics of, okay, my finger has to move like this and my arm has to move like this, right? The sort of poetic imagery that you talked about, that we talk to our students about, that is what's going to be most helpful in a moment like this. What is the sound that you want in that chorale? What are you trying to, how are you trying to shape the phrase? And you can see from the pianist's face, I think, that he was thinking about that, right? That he was thinking about the sound he was trying to craft.
The meaning of the music.
Right, exactly. And the muscle memory was taking care of the specifics of how that was executed. But if he thought about the specifics of how to execute it, it wouldn't have come out. So thinking about, this is the big picture I want, trusting the muscle memory to take care of the execution is most likely what's going on. Obviously impossible to say unless we stick them in a brain scanner and see. But that would be what I would say based on what we know.
I'm curious what it's been like for you as a violist working with pianists.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because there's so many commonalities between different sorts of musicians, instrumentalists, singers, what have you. But there's many differences, right? As a violist, my two hands do very different things, right? And pianists have a million more notes going on. The viola is not...
Thank you for that bit of credit.
You're welcome. The viola is not terribly visual, right? We have this big fingerboard we don't have any frets or anything. And so looking at your instrument is not that helpful or important, but for pianists, the visual and the topography of the keys is often very important. And so the principles of learning that I talk about in my work apply regardless of instrument, but the specific application of them is very instrument specific. And there's a number of things that pianists have to deal with that I, as a violist, never have to think about, like a million different notes all at once. You know, counterpoint going in a million different directions all at once. I don't have to do anything with my feet, right? And you guys have to deal with pedals. That's something that, you know, you have to think about. But there's all sorts of things that I have to think about that you as a pianist never have to think about. Intonation being the biggest one.
Yes.
Right? You know, you press the right key, the note comes out. That's not how it is, right, for violists. So it's very interesting to me as both a musician and someone who's applying the science of learning and memory to practicing and performing, to look at, okay, what are the specific challenges of this instrument and how can this science be applied to this instrument? Take the principles, apply those principles, but then look more specifically, okay, what does this instrument need?
How much have you learned from that process?
So much, so much. I mean, a big thing that pianists do that string players tend not to do is practicing hand separate, right? Or just practicing a single voice, or practicing one hand and sort of miming the other. And we as string players do sort of do hand separate, like we'll do just the bow or we'll do just the left hand, but not nearly as much as pianists. Typically our music doesn't have like multiple voices going on at once, like piano music does. And so for myself, in thinking through and talking with pianists about, okay, these are the challenges you face, how can you take this apart and make it more manageable for yourself, because that's what you have to do in the practice room, right? You have to break it down into manageable pieces and not overload your brain with too much information at once. Thinking about how pianists do that has informed me as a string player in terms of ways that I might do that differently for myself, and thinking creatively about, okay, a pianist might, for instance, play just the left hand, but mime the right hand so that you can hear the left hand, but the coordination is happening between the hands. That sort of silent miming of one side of the body is not something we as string players do that much. But it's been very interesting for me to experiment and see, like, oh, that's really interesting when I do this. What do I notice my bow wants to do when I'm miming my left hand, for instance?
Yeah.
So
Something
yeah, I
that,
always just, yeah,
that's
no,
very
sorry, go ahead.
interesting. I was going to ask you, when we're under the pressure of a competition, something about how we listen to ourselves also changes.
Yes.
Can you maybe illuminate a bit of what goes on in the pressure of a spotlight?
Yeah, great question. My teacher in undergrad used to say when we get on stage, we grow giant ears and we hear things we've never heard before and we will never hear again. And I think every musician knows that phenomenon of being on stage and feeling like something sounded terrible and then listening to a recording and you can't even hear whatever you thought this giant mistake was, right? And then it's very comforting. Oh, thank goodness nobody heard that. But I mean, the biggest thing I think that happens on stage is we feel the pressure, but especially in a competition, you feel the judgment, right? I mean, in a competition, you are there to be judged. Like that's kind of the whole point, right, of what you're doing. And that environment of being watched and being judged can make it very easy for us to go into that overthinking that I was talking about, and not allowing your muscle memory to take over things. It's very easy to go into that. The way I like to think about it is like standing over your own shoulder, like a teacher would stand over your shoulder in an exam, and then you start to sort of second guess yourself every which way, right? Are these the notes? Do I know what this is? And that's why often like people's first recital or first competition doesn't go very well, because they don't know what's going to happen to them in that pressure, and they're not prepared for that sort of overthinking that happens. But once you get to the level of, obviously, this competition, these performers have performed a lot. They've probably played in a lot of competitions. And so they have come up with strategies for making sure that the conscious brain doesn't jump in and try to over control everything. And again, this is getting back to what we were talking about with thinking big picture, thinking about things outside your body. There's a big area of research on what's known as external focus versus internal focus. External focus is on focusing on something outside your body, so the effect that you want your music making in this case to have, or how you want it to sound. Internal focus is focusing on the specifics of what your body is doing and how to make your body do it. A lot of this research has been done in athletes, but there is research in this vein on musicians as well. And what it finds across the board is that when people have an external focus, so focusing on something outside the body, they perform much better, particularly when they're under pressure, because it gets you out of this overthinking and over-controlling your muscle memory. But as an individual musician, you have to figure out, okay, what is the best way to keep me out of that overthinking? It's not as simple as saying, well, I just can't overthink. I think we all know that that's not going to work like at all, right? It would be way too easy if that was the case. Brains do much better when we distract them with something else to do rather than tell them, don't do this. And so and often that distraction for us as musicians, that helpful distraction is, again, thinking about the sound you want, thinking about what you're trying to express, thinking about what you're trying to say through the music, and really, really keeping your focus on that, especially under pressure, so that the conscious brain doesn't try to jump in and sort of micromanage everything in an unhelpful way.
That's really fascinating, because as pianists, we often, I mean, one of the first questions I ever get asked as a masterclass teacher is, how do you avoid memory slips? And we tend to attribute that to a lack of learning or a lack of consciousness. But what you're basically saying is there can be too much consciousness of what's going on that can trip you up.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's kind of both things, right? If somebody doesn't know the score, right, really, really deeply, and doesn't have this really deep understanding of the score, then that isn't going to go well, obviously, in a performance. But if you do have that deep understanding, and you start to micromanage in a performance, yeah, it's not going to go well. You're going to have a memory slip because you're going to start second guessing yourself and micromanaging yourself. But if you have that deep understanding of the score, you've practiced really well, your muscle memory is strong, your oral memory of what does this piece sound like is strong, you know with a lot of clarity what you're trying to express, then just focusing on that and not focusing on all the details of how do I play this, what are these specific notes, that's going to serve you better in a performance situation than hyper focusing on details.
Something that's fascinating about hearing competition performances, that one after the other in such a quick succession, and they're all really well prepared. It reminds me of something that one of my teachers told me, which is you learn all of this technical detail of the score in order to be able to forget it on stage and just communicate music.
Exactly.
How does that hold up to the research?
It holds up really well to the research. I mean, it's the same thing we've been talking about, that like you absolutely need that deep preparation. You have to go into those technical details. You have to go into those musical details. But you have to practice them enough, and you have to practice them in the way that they are so just automatic and embedded in how we feel like it's in our body, but how our brain is understanding the music, that when you get on stage, you can, it's not that you forget all the details, they are definitely in there, but that you can focus on these big picture things we've been talking about and trust that your muscle memory knows how to do it, that you can trust your musical intuition, that you can trust your physical intuition, and that you know how to do these things because you've put in the preparation. And yeah, if you start thinking about too many details, especially in the fast, flashy stuff, like it's all over. You're not going to be able to play well. It's just too much information at once.
You've just given me the perfect setup for our next musical example, actually, which is Michał Oleszak playing something very slow and lyrical and kaleidoscopic, the Szymanowski Masks. Could we have that example now, and then we'll talk about tone color? Molly, I'd love to ask you, in this performance, I was particularly struck by the pianist's ability to voice and create legato without too much pedal in what I know is a really difficult score, often 3 staves, 3 different layers. When we understand something like clear voicing on a piano, we mean it's not over-pedaled. How must someone practice in order to be able to produce that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's multiple aspects to this, and I would say the most important is first and foremost that the pianist has a good idea in their mind of what they want it to sound like. We haven't talked about mental practice yet and the ability to hear things in your mind, but that is such an important skill for us as musicians, because anything that comes out of the instrument should start as clarity in our imagination over what we want. And so talking about clear voicing, like if as a pianist you don't have a model in your mind of, okay, this is what I'm going for, it can be very hard to know if you've achieved it, because then you don't have anything to compare it to, right? What comes out of the piano. And so having a lot of clarity in your mind of, okay, how do I want this to sound? Can I hear this in my mind the way I want? Do I know what I'm going for? And then on the instrument itself, it often takes a lot of experimentation with the various ingredients of how do I voice something well in terms of, for me, it's use of the bow, right? How am I going to use the bow to craft the sound that I want? For you as pianists, there's all sorts of ingredients in terms of how you approach the keys, right? With your hands and your fingers and blah, blah, blah. All sorts of things that I don't have a lot of knowledge of because I'm not a pianist, right? I don't know all these little
But
specifics.
you must hear it when you do chamber music with pianists, whether they're aware of how to complement your sound, how to support a bowed sound, for example.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so the pianist, again, has to have a clear sense of, okay, this is the sound that I'm going for. They have to be able to hear the difference between this is voiced well and this is not voiced well, right? So that they can compare those things. And they have to know, okay, when something is not voiced well, that is the result of XYZ physical things that caused it to sound this way that's not voiced well, versus when it is voiced well, okay, that was caused by these other physical ingredients of how I did that. And that's part of the piano teacher's role, right? Is to teach a student those things. And then at this level of playing, that the pianist is able to have that internal sense of, okay, this is what I want it to sound like, and then experiment on the piano. Okay, how am I going to approach the keys? How am I going to leave one note and go to the other, and experiment with that approach, and then notice, oh, okay, that's the voicing I want. How did I do that?
Right.
I need to be able to recreate that, right, and have that clarity. And I think often as musicians, and this is something I talk to my students a lot about, I think we often are very good at being like, no, that sounds bad, I don't like that. But we're not as good at being like, okay, yes, that was what I wanted, that is good, let me make sure that I can recreate that and I know how I did that. We're often so focused on, no, I didn't like that, that we forget to pay attention to, okay, that is how I want it, how did I do that? How can I recreate that? Again, to make it automatic so that when you're on stage, you're not thinking so much about the specifics of how do I do this physically, that the muscle memory takes care of it, and you as the musician are just hearing that sound you want in your mind, and you're recreating it on the piano in real time.
I was so happy by this example of the Szymanowski because he's jumping around the piano to different registers and creating different effects, sometimes very high on the piano followed by very low. And it's very orchestral. How does someone use mental practicing to get to the point that they're leaping around the piano so suddenly, changing dynamics, changing textures, changing colors, such that it comes out automatically as a natural narrative?
Right. Yeah. Great question. I mean, I talk to people a lot about the importance of mental practice. And in terms of something like that, I would, if I was playing it, I would want to make sure, okay, can I hear it how I want? Can I hear the voicing, the articulation, the dynamics, everything involved in the sound? Can I hear that in the various registers? Maybe I have to do it slowly in my mind first to make sure I have that auditory clarity in my mind. But then can I hear that like in real time in my mind? And then the next ingredient is, okay, can I feel what I have to do to do that? Can I feel how I have to approach the instrument itself? What does it feel like to play in this high register in terms of approach to the keys in terms of the articulation on these notes, and then I have to jump.
You're talking about physical feeling.
The physical feeling, yeah, exactly. That when we play, we get a lot of feedback from the instrument itself, right? But we also feel in our bodies what we have to do in terms of approaching the instrument in terms of energy, or on string instruments, we talk a lot about weight, like the weight of the bow in the string. And I know you guys talk about like arm weight, right, into the keys. Right. And so feeling that, can you imagine that physical feeling in your mind? Do you have clarity, or are there, I call them black holes, or is there anywhere that you're just like, I don't know what I'm doing here. I can't feel this. I can't hear this. For pianists also, knowing where you are on the keyboard, can you visualize that in your mind and know where you are? For pianists also, like the shape of your hands, because it's rare that you're just playing like one note, right? Like, can you feel those shapes? Can you see those shapes? Are you aware of the topography of the piano, black keys versus white keys, right? That's another really important ingredient, that you're able to sort of feel that topography and how your body interacts with that topography. And if that is clear in your mind, both the auditory, the visual, I said both, auditory, visual, and kinesthetic, if those three are clear in your mind, then it's much more likely you're going to be able to execute it on the piano, because you have that mental clarity. And then when you have the actual feedback from the instrument, it makes it a lot easier, because you don't have to just recreate it all in your mind. It's a cooperation between you and the instrument.
Now, speaking of cooperating, you string players have an advantage we don't have. You can bow and you can vibrate your sound, right? We can't change much. What kind of feedback do you get from piano students about things when they get nervous if they don't pedal enough, or if they suddenly are forced by their teacher to play without pedal? What sorts of complaints do you hear, and how do you work with that?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, for string players, for us, the equivalent would be like taking away the vibrato, so you just hear what the bow is doing.
Yeah.
And right, and it's very illuminating, because you see, like for pianists, like when you have to play without the pedal, you see how you're covering up all sorts of stuff by over pedaling, and then you see sort of all this like unclarity that is covered when you pedal. For us as string players, when you take away the vibrato, you notice where your intonation isn't very good because you were covering it up with your vibrato, or where your bow is really not doing a good job like connecting the phrase because you were doing it with your vibrato. And so yeah, it's often very illuminating for pianists to have to play in that way, and it shows them where they've been over-relying, for instance, in this case, on the pedal to do things that maybe the pedal is not. That's not the job of the pedal. That's the job of.
I can just hear all the piano pedagogues watching this, celebrating that this is being said by a scientist as well as a musician. But I'm curious to ask this: how effective is it in the training of pianists? And you're coming at this from a scientific point of view as well. When we encourage our students to practice most of the time without the pedal.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is really helpful, because it's clarifying. It shows, okay, what isn't clean, what isn't working, where do you not know what you're doing? I mean, this comes up a lot for string players, where you take away the vibrato and suddenly the phrase is just like totally flat, because the bow isn't doing anything. They've been doing all of their musical expression with the vibrato, and yeah, you can do a lot with the vibrato, you can do a lot with the pedal, but that's not the only thing, right? There are other ingredients that come into it when you're trying to express things, and taking away that often simple tool, right? The pedal or the vibrato, taking away that simple tool really shows, okay, where are your other tools falling down on the job and not really contributing to what you're trying to do musically. And it really forces you to, like for me as a string player, it really forces you to think, okay, how am I going to use my bow artistically to show what I want through this phrase without over relying on the vibrato? I think it's likely the same for pianists taking away the pedal. How are you going to play artistically, but also play cleanly without the pedal, covering things up
Which
for
in a
you,
competition
right?
is an immediate thing you listen for, right? The cleanliness of the articulation, the clarity of the phrasing. I'm curious, another question that I actually received this beforehand. A student wrote to me saying, sometimes when they're practicing and their teacher says, remove the pedal and play the same passage for me, sometimes they suddenly have memory problems. Where does that come from?
Yeah, that's a great question. That it's hard to say for any given person where that comes from, but my guess would be that when you remove the pedal, it sounds quite different, right? And if somebody is relying solely on the sound for knowing what's happening in the music and keeping their place, and then the sound suddenly changes, it's different aural information coming in. And my guess would be that that person's muscle memory of what their fingers are supposed to be doing is actually quite weak. And they've been relying solely on the sound. Now the sound has changed, and that's really disorienting. And the muscle memory is weak, and then they realize, I don't know what I'm doing, and then maybe they start to overthink. So getting back to the different types of memory we were talking about, when you're playing from memory, it's really important to strengthen your aural memory. What is it supposed to sound like? Your muscle memory, what does it feel like to play? And also what's known as your declarative memory, like what are the actual notes and rhythms on the page? How is this piece put together? To strengthen these different types of memory equally so that you aren't thrown if one element becomes different, or if, I mean, I think we all know the experience of being under pressure and your brain just kind of like goes blank and you can't even remember your own name. And it's just like brains do that, right? We have these moments of like, oh, who am I? Where am I? Right? Brains do that under pressure. But if you have these sort of backup systems of different types of memory, it's very unusual that all three types, aural memory, muscle memory, and declarative memory, it's very unusual that all three of them would break down all at once because they're different types of memory. So if you have all three equally strong and suddenly you don't remember how it goes, but your muscle memory is there for you, that's fine. You will keep playing, and then you can sort of listen to yourself. I've had this experience myself. You can listen to yourself and be like, oh, right, that's how it goes. And then you'll be fine. Or if your muscle memory suddenly is, I mean, with pianists, you guys have to play on a different instrument every time. I can imagine that could be very confusing.
That was my next question, exactly. How do they adapt to a different instrument every concert hall they go to?
Right, exactly. I am so glad I don't have to do that as a violist, like play on a different, I would find that really disorienting.
That must be nice.
It is, yeah, it is. But like, I can imagine that would be really disorienting for muscle memory. If you're playing on a piano that has like a really, really difficult action, let's say, and you have to like put a lot more into it versus the piano that you're used to playing on, like I can imagine that would be really disorienting for muscle memory. But if you have these other types of memory equally strong, you're not going to be as thrown. At the same time, that's why it's important for pianists to practice on lots of different pianos, so they get used to, adjusting. And actually, I've talked to a number of pianists about this. I think it's important for pianists to practice on really crappy pianos on purpose as a way of performance preparation. Not that you're going to like spend hours, but like do a practice run through on a really terrible piano. That's going to really throw you off because it's going to feel bad. It's going to sound bad. Like the whole experience is going to be terrible. But if you can get through that on that really terrible piano, then when you have a nice piano in the competition, it will be a much better experience.
Something that I mentioned before we heard this Szymanowski expert, I'd just like to circle back to it. What's your concept as a listener of tone color? When you hear someone like this performing so many different dynamics and voicing things, as a scientist, for example, how do you approach teaching tone color or listening for color?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, for me, my approach is to make sure that students do a lot of listening of great artists, specifically for tone color, and listening for, okay, what do you hear between these three artists, let's say, that's different in terms of their tone color? Can you hear the difference? And do you know how they're doing that? So I think it starts with listening, to have that sort of aural sensitivity, right? And then in terms of developing the ability to do it yourself, again, it goes back to having that internal clarity of what do you want. But I think that something, especially that like younger high-level musicians, I'm thinking like high school, early college musicians, typically have not made the connection for themselves yet, is that all artistic things are realized through our technique, right? Tone color is realized through your technique. So you have to not only know what you want it to sound like, but you have to have the technical means of achieving that. Right. And I think one of the roles of a teacher, especially at that level when students are kind of emerging from like they're kids and they're just playing for fun, and now they're like, you know, a serious musician, but you know, they're sort of early on in their journey, is helping students learn those technical skills and connect, okay, when you do this on the instrument, it gives you this in terms of tone color, so that it isn't this sort of mysterious thing, and it's something that students can actively and intentionally choose. I think a lot of, like high school, college musicians, often play really intuitively, right? And they've heard a lot of great recordings and they're kind of sort of mimicking in a way, in a more sophisticated way than that, but they don't necessarily know how they're doing what they're doing. And I do think it is really important for them to understand the how behind the technique, so that they can use that intentionally to craft their sound, to craft the tone color, because that makes for a much more interesting and much more sort of well-informed, that's not the best word, but well-informed performance, that it's actually artistically interesting rather than just purely based on intuition.
I think we're hovering around a point that's really important to make, especially at a competition where the technical level is immediately obvious. The equipment of the pianist is known after 5 bars. So you're saying that our brains, in a way, would it be fair to say that they're internalizing the ideas of artistic expression and technical execution as a mixture? We often tell students, right, it's a mixture of having enough technique and being creative enough and having artistic vision. Is that also held up by research?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, if you don't have an artistic vision, you're not going to be able to realize it physically, because your body won't have any information from your brain about what it wants to do. But if you have this great artistic vision, but you haven't connected that to the physicality of how do I do this on the piano, it doesn't matter what your artistic vision is. Like, I could listen to, you know, piano recordings for the next 40 years of my life and have this amazing artistic vision for what I would want, you know, a particular piece on the piano's play it to sound like. I took 1 semester of class piano in college. I really cannot play the piano. And so it wouldn't matter that I had this artistic vision, because I don't have any knowledge about how to realize it technically, physically on the piano. So the two absolutely have to go hand in hand.
And there's something about the brain and the way we perceive tone color and sound that's also connected to how we practice then.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, whenever you hear anything, the auditory cortex is processing what you've heard, not just in terms of pitch, but in terms of all the details of the sound. But as you train on a particular instrument, there's a lot of research looking at, for instance, like musicians versus non-musicians and how they perceive all sorts of aspects of music, pitch, harmony, like whatever. And musicians have far more sensitive brains. We can hear all sorts of things that non-musicians can't hear. And it's not that we were born that way with sort of more sensitive hearing. It's very clearly due to our training. And so going back to this question of like tone color, that's why I said, you know, starting with the listening, because you have to train your brain to be able to hear these subtle differences in tone color. We often talk about training the ear. It's not the ear itself. It's the auditory cortex. It's the brain. Being able to hear much more finely grained distinctions in pitch, tone color, like whatever. And I mean, the brain is such a flexible organ, right? Whatever we ask it to do, it's going to adapt itself to be able to do that, both in terms of what it responds to, but we also see like actual physical structural changes in the brain due to our training as musicians. So yeah, it absolutely, what we have to train ourselves to do is absolutely reflected in how the brain is both structured and how it's responding to what it hears.
Last question before we jump to the last excerpt from yesterday's performances. What's happening in the mind of someone listening to music when it really brings them catharsis or emotional satisfaction?
That's a really good question. I mean, there's a lot of research on looking at like emotional response to music, and in particular they look at because it's easy to measure when people experience chills listening to music, right? That can be really powerful. And it's interesting that reaction to music is extremely individual. When they do research on like looking at what gives people chills when they listen to music, often they have the individual participants bring in music that they know causes chills for them, because you can't just like play a piece of music and everyone's going to have that sort of reaction, because it's very individual based on our individual experiences in life and how we're you know perceiving the music and what have you. So yeah, that research is super fascinating. It also finds that there is one sort of brain response that is in response to sort of anticipation of people's favorite part, let's say, and then a different brain response when you actually get to the favorite part. And so the anticipation is often just as people enjoy the anticipation just as much as the actual like event itself. And it's both of them are mediated by the dopamine system in the brain, but it is they are different responses, which I just think is cool, because I think we all know that experience of like that part you really love is coming, and that's almost just as enjoyable, right, as when you actually like get to that really satisfying climax or whatever.
It's true, and it's so interesting to hear that, because just to wrap it up, that we're in the context of a competition, there are also 9 individuals on the jury who are going to hear this from their point of view and from their perspective, and it's not that every single one of them is listening with exactly the same expectations. But I think most of us who judge in competitions and know what this is like, we want to hear performances that are touching. We want to hear performances that really speak to us somehow. But that looks differently for every individual.
Right, exactly. I mean, yes, it looks different for every individual, and that's why you don't just have one judge at a competition, right? You have a whole bunch of judges. But at the same time, I think that like generally the people that tend to do better in competitions are those who really give the jury an artistic experience, and they're not just up there like doing technical fireworks that has no sort of emotion behind it. Like technical fireworks, those are impressive, but what really stands out is that sort of emotional connection from the performer to the judge. And I mean, I've judged competitions before where someone has played something that I'm like, you know, I would never play it that way in a million years. That is not my interpretation. I may like really disagree, but it was really powerful and it really spoke to me, even if I disagree with it. That to me is much more sort of impressive than someone who comes up and plays something very technically clean, but I am left feeling like, okay, you know, that I didn't like have an emotional experience at the same time.
That's really good to hear, actually, because in piano competitions, of course, we're always listening for the artistic expression, because this is an instrument that's inherently a little percussive. And we like the feeling that the performers are making something of their time on stage to make this personal artistic statement. As you were talking, I did get a live question from somebody. You can answer as quickly as you like. What's the best thing to do on the day of performing or a couple of hours before one goes on stage?
Yeah, that's a great question. My shortest answer would be go check out Noah Kageyama's Bulletproof Musician website, because he is like the person for performance psychology. My longer answer is that it's really important to get yourself in that performance mindset, that you're not playing through all your hardest passages as fast as you can to make sure that they still work. That is going to get you into the mindset of overthinking and, you know, hyper controlling yourself like we were talking about. I often find it most helpful right before a performance to play something I really love to play and just enjoy the sound of my instrument, enjoy playing music. So that I'm in that mindset of just connecting with music, just connecting with the sound, just connecting with the expression, so that I go into the actual performance, and that's my focus, that sort of big picture thing that we were talking about at the beginning, rather than hyper-focusing on all those details, because I know I used to do that. I used to like go through all my hard spots and check and make sure they were still there, and that would translate into going on stage and sort of doubting myself, like, I hope they're still there. I wonder if I can do this, you know, like, again, standing over my own shoulder and being like, are you sure you can do this? And that doesn't result in a good performance.
I really appreciate all your insights today into this world, and all the research that you've done combines music with science, particularly neuroscience, and I think that's an important message that everyone sees, that first of all, it's possible to do an undergrad studying 2 different things as demanding as viola and neuroscience. and to have made such contributions to our field as you have. We thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
To close the studio today, I'd love for everyone to hear, for the second time, Julie Heisman's performance of Paderewski Piano Sonata, Opus 21, which was played last night. Can we have that excerpt now to finish up the studio today?